Dear colleagues, first of all, let me tell you, you are a wonderful audience. At this hour, the sun is shining on top of it, and still you are here, so thank you very much. I think this will be the start of a second very exciting day at the World Social Sciences Forum. The topic of this first plenary session this morning is one social science or many? Question mark. We have, in order to address that question, a keynote speaker, John Elster, and a discussant, Rainer Silbereisen. And there will be some room for, of course, discussions with the audience. As a chair of this session, my main task will be the timekeeper to make sure that indeed there is enough room for discussion, and I will introduce the speakers and say a little bit about the topic. And let me start immediately by the topic, one social science or many. I guess if you look at it from an institutional perspective, an institutional point of view, then we can immediately come up with a very simple answer and say, yes, of course, there are many social sciences because we have many social sciences disciplines. We all know what I would like to call the grand old disciplines like economy, sociology, psychology, but we also have some of them pretty new, younger disciplines, which a lot of them are focused on specific topics of study, such as criminology, leisure studies, yes, that does exist, area studies of all kinds, etc., etc. And then, and this is amazing, we also have what I would like to call the interdisciplinary disciplines. These are social scientists who try to find for themselves a specific niche in the academic world, and they start reinventing the whole issue of disciplines. For instance, when I was younger than today, I used to call myself a legal psychologist because I was studying the psychology of legal procedures. And we had our own, and they still exist, of course, we had our own institutions. There was a European Association for Legal Studies. We tried to have a Belgian Association for Legal Studies, etc. Meaning that I believe that the proliferation of disciplines somehow plays an important role in creating a kind of structure that allows social scientists to have enough functions to distribute amongst themselves. So anybody at some stage in his or her career can call himself vice president of something. And if that doesn't work in a discipline, you still have the International Social Sciences Council to do that. So we have the disciplines. But of course, the real question is not institutional, although I think there is a link to it. But the real question is there across all these social sciences, disciplines and sub-disciplines, a kind of unity? Meaning, is there place, is there scope for a common language across the disciplines? Is there room even for unifying grand theories? These are the real important questions that we will try to tackle this morning. And we will do so by giving the floor to, first of all, John Elster, and allow me to introduce our keynote speaker of this morning. John is a philosopher, but also a little bit trained as a sociologist. His tutor of his PhD thesis was Raymond Aron. And today he is professor at the Collège de France, where he holds the chair Chaire de Rationalité et Sciences Sociales, which is a beautiful name for a chair, I think. And he combines that position in Paris with many fellowships, such as being a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, etc. And as you know, he's been visiting professor at many universities in Europe and the USA. He's, of course, well known as an author of more than 30 books, I believe, about different topics such as transitional justice, transitions to democracy, etc. But in '89, he published a book that became rather famous, and that book is called Nuts and Bolts for the Social Sciences. Interesting title, especially if you remember what Sen told yesterday about screwdrivers, but this became a very widely acclaimed volume that in 2007, I believe, was reprinted in a new and expanded edition with a new title. The new title is now Explaining Social Behavior, More Nuts and Bolts for the Social Sciences. And in this book, John presents an overview of all kinds of explanatory mechanisms in the social sciences. And it is based upon many examples from psychology, behavioral economics, history, etc. So I think he knows very well the diversity of the social sciences. But the question then indeed is, what binds us across all these examples? What is the place for unity? Or in other words, again, the question, one social sciences or many? John, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. When I accepted the invitation to give this talk in the fall of 2007, I did not expect that the social sciences, and notably economics, was about to be forced into a deep self-examination triggered by the current financial crisis. It seems as if the Hollywood slogan about the prospects of a newly released movie, "Nobody knows anything," also suddenly applied to basic issues of economics and finance. The status of macroeconomics as a science seems less compelling than before, to put it mildly. As for microeconomics, its status as a science has become increasingly fragile over the last 30 years or so. The other social sciences, notably sociology, had less to lose, as the reputation was not that high in the first place. Before I turn to these matters, I have to spend some time discussing the key terms of the title of my talk, Social and Science. As you may know, a proposed 28th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States has the following wording. It is the inalienable right of each citizen and non-citizen to use any term with the meaning that he or she decides to give it, on the condition that the meaning of the term and some reasons for using it in this sense are stated. So, assuming that this clause applies to the present proceedings, I shall feel free to offer a stipulative definition of social science, guided by my specific aims in this talk and constrained by common usage. In my understanding, the goal of social science is to uncover proximate causes of behavior. On this definition, the historical sciences are part of the social sciences, since they, too, are concerned with the causes of behavior. Although one might try to draw a distinction between historians as consumers of causal mechanisms and social scientists as producers of mechanisms, this would be quite misleading. Tocqueville's study of the Ancien Régime and Paul Venn's study in Le Pain de Cirque of civic giving in classical antiquity both contain more and more fertile mechanisms than almost any work in social science I can think of. Conversely, most economists, sociologists, and political scientists are tool users rather than tool makers. Whereas the social sciences are concerned with the proximate causes of behavior, the search for ultimate causes belongs to evolutionary theory. There is some intersection between social science and the theory of evolution, as exemplified by the disciplines of evolutionary game theory and evolutionary psychology. In my opinion, these disciplines have not yet developed to the point where they can offer testable implications. As is often noted, many of them have the flavor of just so stories. They are consistent with the known facts, but do not pass the crucial test of generating novel facts. And even if someone should disagree with this statement, I appeal to the proposed amendment and claim my right to exclude evolutionary theory from social science. By proximate causes, I have in mind mental phenomena such as beliefs, desires, perceptions, and emotions. This stipulative definition enables me to also exclude neurosocial science, notably neuroeconomics, from the field of social science. Although brain processes are proximate causes of behavior, they are not the kind of causes I shall be talking about. My reason for excluding them is partly my lack of competence in this area, and partly my hunch that these approaches are premature. For instance, identifying neuronal correlates of subtle but important differences between beliefs, such as the difference between believing that someone is an atheist and believing that she is an agnostic, is probably a task for the very distant future. And once again, if anyone disagrees, I appeal to the proposed 28th Amendment. Let me digress briefly on this point, to observe that the title of my talk could also have been One Social Science, Many or None. it sometimes seems as if between the two of them, evolutionary biology and neuroscience occupy more and more of the space that traditionally was the reserved domain of the social sciences. So we might ask, therefore, whether social science is in some danger of disappearing. I do not think there is any immediate danger, and probably not even a remote one. I have no objection in principle to a naturalistic turn in the social sciences. Any such objection would be obscurantist. Yet my amateur impression is that there are so many interactions among parts of the genome, so many interactions among parts of the brain, that it will prove difficult or impossible to establish robust links between subsets on either, on the one hand, and behavior on the other. The claim I made a minute ago, that beliefs and other mental states are the proximate causes of behavior, might seem to commit me to the principle of methodological individualism. And I'm indeed a firm believer in that principle, but it doesn't actually follow from the claim. There has been a recent interest in the idea that groups can have beliefs, intentions, and even emotions that cannot be reduced to the corresponding mental states of their members. As far as I can see, nobody has shown that we need to adopt that idea to explain phenomena that would otherwise resist explanation, so I shall not pursue this issue. But I do want to say a few words about methodological individualism. The claim that all social phenomena should be, and in principle can be, explained by independent variables at the level of the individual. I've always believed, and continue to believe, that the principle is a truism, trivially and boringly true. Durkheim said that, quote, even if individual psychology were to give up all its secrets, it would still not be able to provide the solution to the problems of sociology. I find this statement not as much false as unintelligible. The principle of methodological individualism is routinely violated when firms and households are treated as agents. In the case of households, it has been known for some time that treating them as rational unitary agents does not yield correct predictions. In 1998, Browning and Chiaupori showed that we get better predictions if we disaggregate households into their individual members and assume that these are utility-maximizing agents. But to achieve this result, they also had to assume that consumption choices are Pareto efficient. This assumption is not consistent with methodological individualism, as it excludes, for instance, collective action problems within the household. This remark is not intended as a criticism. In practice, individual-level explanations may be intractably complex and require data that do not exist. My point is only that the use of aggregates as a unit of analysis is always a second-best option, and there is never any reason to choose it for its own sake. So before I try to answer the question on my title, I need to explain the science part of social science. As I understand it, the aim of science is to offer verified, or not yet falsified, causal explanations of observed phenomena. On this account, some alleged social sciences do not count as science. Large chunks of social anthropology, for instance, are closer to literary interpretation than to causal analysis. Also, functional explanation of social phenomena in terms of their consequences rather than their causes do not count as science. An example is the explanation, in quotation marks, of vendettas as a device, in quotation marks, for keeping population within sustainable limits. Maybe vendettas do have that effect, but it cannot be cited to explain them unless we also demonstrate the existence of some kind of homeostatic feedback loop. And to my knowledge, nobody has even tried to do that. In a broad perspective, the work of Foucault and Bourdieu has been especially important in licensing claims of this sort. As I know firsthand from my exposure to current French social science, their influence is persistent and pernicious. I shall also stipulate that social science is cumulative, a claim that can be taken in one of three senses. First, over time, scientists explain more and more facts. Better telescopes enable the exploration of deeper parts of space. Second, new scientific theories build on previous ones, generalize their results, and when necessary, explain their failures. The relation between Newton and Einstein, or between Condorcet and Kenneth Arrow, to take the example from Amartya Sen's lecture yesterday, illustrate this idea. Cumulativity in this sense also implies irreversibility. There are no neo-Newtonians in physics in the way there are neo-Marxists, post-Keynesians, or neo-Austrians in economics. Now, to some extent, of course, these are marginal sects. Yet the current revival of Keynes in mainstream economics shows that even here, in the allegedly most scientific part of the social sciences, the properties of cumulativity and irreversibility are lacking. I do not believe there is cumulative theory building in the social sciences because I do not think there are any successful theories in the social sciences. And by a theory, I mean a set of interconnected universal propositions from which, given initial conditions, unique, sharp predictions can be derived. Although the social sciences do contain would-be theories in this sense, none of them are successful in the sense of their predictions being routinely verified to a reasonable degree of precision. The main candidate for a social science theory is obviously rational choice theory, including game theory. In contemporary social science, it is the dominant paradigm in economics, and to a lesser degree in political science, and to some extent also in sociology. I shall have more to say about rational choice theory later. For now, let me only note that the field of sociology, which has a proud tradition of theory building, seems to have lost its self-confidence. Unlike rational choice theory, network theory and agent-based modeling do not pretend to yield strong predictions across large varieties of behavior. So let me now state the third sense in which the social sciences can be cumulative. It relies on the idea that the basic units of social science are mechanisms rather than theories. And by mechanisms, I mean frequently occurring and easily recognizable causal patterns triggered under generally unknown conditions or with indeterminate consequences. And since this bare statement may be close to unintelligible, I shall offer three examples, the first two inspired by Tocqueville. So if a king offers tax exemptions to the nobility, but not to the bourgeoisie, the latter may react either by envy towards their rivals or by anger towards the king. And even if he cannot predict which of these two reactions will occur, whichever of them does occur can be explained by the king's behavior. If a king enacts repressive measures, his action can make the subjects less likely to rebel because the measures heighten their fear, and also more likely to rebel because the measures increase their hatred. The net effect is in general unpredictable, but if in a given case we observe that repression causes rebellion, we can conclude that the second effect dominated the first. And as a third example, let me cite La Fontaine's dictum that each believes easily what he fears and what he hopes. Now, since the hope that a given state of affair will obtain is equivalent to the fear that it will not obtain, what determines whether in a given situation the first or the second belief will be triggered? In the recent movements of the stock market, there may have been a point when agents switched from unjustified optimism to unjustified pessimism, but as Alan Greenspan recently wrote in the Financial Times, the psychology of the switch itself seems ill understood. And to further illustrate the ambiguity and indeterminacy of mechanisms, consider also the gambler's fallacy and its nameless converse. The purchase of earthquake insurance sometimes increases sharply after an earthquake, but then falls steadily as memory fades. Like the gamblers who make the mistake of believing that red is more likely to come up again if it has come up several times in a row, the purchasers form the belief by using the availability heuristic. Their judgment about the likelihood of an event is shaped by the ease with which it can be brought to mind, recent events being more easily available than earlier ones. Conversely, people living in areas that are subject to frequent floods sometimes believe, or act as if they believe, that a flood is less likely to occur in year n+1 if one has occurred in year n. They are like gamblers who make the mistake of believing that red is less likely to come up again if it has come up several times in a row, forming their beliefs by relying on the representativeness heuristic. They believe, or act as if they believe, that a short sequence of events is likely to be representative of a longer sequence in which it is embedded. And in casinos, players have in fact been found to be equally vulnerable to either effect. I shall cite many more mechanisms shortly. For now, I only want to state that the social sciences are cumulative in a sense of acquiring more and more mechanisms. Each new mechanism is added to the toolbox or to the repertoire of the social scientist. And the progress is irreversible, since mechanisms identified by Aristotle, Montaigne, or Tocqueville are still with us today. I can now begin to answer the question in the title. And my answer is that there is only one social science, but that it is not unified. In his massive treatise, Foundations of Social Behavior, James Coleman argued that rational choice theory could be a unified and unifying theory of all of social science. And with one qualification, it did indeed hold out a promise of a unified theory capable of generating unique predictions given initial conditions. The qualification arises from the fact that the theory failed to prescribe and predict behavior if the situation is sufficiently complex. And the current financial crisis illustrates this point perfectly. It is not so much that the actors in the market are irrational, although they may be that too, as that nobody knows what it would be rational to do. As a matter of fact, this was not news. And allow me to cite from my book, Explaining Social Behavior, published in April 2007, 4 months before the subprime crisis broke. Many models impute cognitive capacities to agents that they demonstrably do not possess. The point is so trivial that it is almost embarrassing. How can an economist assume that an agent has the ability to carry out calculations that he or she, the economist, needs many pages of highly technical appendices to spell out? The temptation is strong to say, come on, get real. In his book, The Black Swan, published around the same time, Nassim Nicholas Taleb made a different claim to the same effect. He argued, on the one hand, that the distribution of many important economic and financial variables is non-Gaussian, and on the other hand, that because of the nature of the distributions, we will never have enough data points to estimate their parameters. And in more technical work, Martin Weitzman refers to this problem as one of structural uncertainty. Bracketing this question of indeterminacy, the promise of a unifying theory that so entranced Coleman and many others, and I think I have to include myself in some past incarnation, was in any case never fulfilled. In many well-documented cases, agents failed to live up to the prescriptions and predictions of rational choice theory, even when these are within their cognitive grasp. In other words, they behave irrationally. In a general way, this too is not exactly news. The Allais paradox and Ellsbury paradox, stated in 1953 and 1961 respectively, show that most people violate a standard version of rational choice theory. However, for a long time, these and other anomalies, such as the gambler's fallacy, were not taken very seriously, since nobody could propose an alternative theory to account for them. As you cannot beat something with nothing, and as rational choice theory definitely was something, with many achievements to its credit, it remained in place as a dominant paradigm. Although irrational behavior was recognized, it was viewed only as a residual category. There was no positive account of irrational behavior, nothing that was, in the title of a recent bestseller, predictably irrational. At the same time, rational choice theory had, and still has, undisputed success in many policy areas. The assumption that economic agents respond to incentives has been shown to be valid in numerous instances. Now, this situation changed in the mid-1970s. In 1974, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky published the first of their major papers on decision-making under uncertainty, in which they introduced the heuristics of availability and representativeness that I mentioned earlier. And in 1975, George Ainsley resurrected the theory of hyperbolic time discounting proposed by R.H. Strauss in 1955, and showed that it could account for many puzzling inconsistencies in behavior. A later landmark was a 1979 paper by Kahneman and Tversky on prospect theory, one of the most influential papers in the history of economics, and the one for which Kahneman, after the death of Tversky, received the Alfred Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. Incidentally, although this prize has mostly been awarded to economists working firmly within the rational choice framework, This was the only time it has been given for work that has generated verified predictions. By contrast, the Nobel Prize in Physics is given only for such work, which explains why Stephen Hawking has not received it, nor any string theorist. In the 35 years that followed, the research program of behavioral economics has unearthed a vast number of positive mechanisms that generate predictably irrational behavior. Although it would be impossible to attempt a complete statement of the irrationality-generating mechanisms, I shall try to produce a representative shortlist. If you go by the literature, the two most important ones are probably loss aversion, an aspect of prospect theory, and hyperbolic discounting. In my view, emotions are at least equally important, although for reasons I shall explain, they have proved less tractable for experimental purposes. And among other mechanisms, the following may be cited. The sunk cost fallacy and the planning fallacy, which, as you can imagine, are especially deadly in conjunction. The tendency of unusual events to trigger stronger emotional reactions, an implication of the norm theory to which I shall return later. The cold-hot and hot-cold empathy gaps, trade-off aversion and ambiguity aversion, anchoring in the elicitation of beliefs and preferences, the representativeness and availability heuristics, the conjunction and disjunction fallacies, the certainty effect and the pseudo-certainty effect, choice, bracketing, framing, and mental accounting, cases when less is more and more is less, sensitiveness to changes from a reference point rather than to absolute levels, status quo bias and the salience of default options, meliorizing rather than maximizing, motivated reasoning and self-serving biases in judgment, flaws of expert judgment and of expert predictions, self-signaling and magical thinking, non-consequentialist and reason-based choice, overconfidence and illusion of control, and spurious pattern finding. And here are a few selected references. As stated, this list is not very informative. I produce it mainly to underline the fact that unlike rational choice economics, behavioral economics does not rest on a unified theory. It consists of a bunch of theories or mechanisms that are not deductively linked among themselves. Yet there is only one social science because all practitioners can use the same toolbox. There's no reason why an economist should refrain from using a mechanism developed by an historian of classical antiquity. In fact, an accomplishment in which I take some pride is that in my book, Sour Grapes, I managed to communicate the idea of adaptive preferences developed by Paul Venn, a historian of classical antiquity, to the community of economists. In this perspective, human behavior seems to be guided by a number of unrelated quirks rather than by consistent maximization of utility. In fact, there are so many quirks that one suspects that for any observed behavior, there will be a quirk that fits it. And I believe that many mainstream economists seem to shy away from behavioral economics because they think it invites ad hoc and ex post explanations. Another similar source of resistance by the mainstream is due to the plethora of motivations invoked by writers within behavioral economics. As we all know, Homo economicus is supposed to be not only rational, but also consistently self-interested. The second feature of his makeup is less central than the first. Gary Becker, a staunch defender of the rationality assumption, has done much to further the study of altruism in economics. Yet, for three distinct reasons, most economists are more comfortable with the assumption that agents are self-interested. And they are so first, I believe, because of what you might call the macho tradition of the discipline. As Robert Frank has written, the flint-eyed researcher fears no great humiliation than to have called some action altruistic, only to have a more sophisticated colleague later demonstrate that it was self-serving. Economists often seem prone to what has been called the hermeneutics of suspicion. For instance, if economic migrants send remittances back home, the suspicion is that they are basically bribing their fellow citizens to remain in the old country so that they will not compete with them on the labor market in a new country. I'm not making this up. Second, economists prefer the assumption of self-interest because in their role as institutional designers, they want to economize on virtue. Following David Hume, they start from the assumption that it is a just political maxim that every man must be supposed to be a knave, though at the same time it appears somewhat strange that a maxim should be true in politics, which is false in fact. But over time, of course, one may end up believing that a fiction is actually true. And finally, economists may assume self-interest in motivations for reasons of theoretical simplicity or parsimony. Paraphrasing Tolstoy, every selfish person is alike, but all non-selfish persons are non-selfish in their own ways. And behavioral economists have come up with an amazing range of non-selfish motivations or social preferences, including altruism, envy, resentment, inequality aversion, fairness, and many others. And once again, there is a suspicion that for any observed behavior, one can find a non-selfish motivation that would fit it. And once again, the risk of ad hoc and ex post explanations seems very real. But I want to distinguish sharply between ex post and ad hoc. Ad hoc explanations are, of course, to be avoided. They are stipulated for the sole purpose of saving the phenomena. A genuine explanation has to do more than merely provide a hypothesis from which the explanandum can be deduced. Because given any social event or any social fact, any social scientist worth his or her salt should be able to come up with half a dozen possible accounts that could explain it. To argue that one of them does explain it, additional steps are needed. Plausible rival accounts have to be set up and then shot down, and additional testable implications of the favored account have to be derived and verified. And if these are novel facts, not previously observed, they lend even more strength to the explanation. By contrast, there is nothing wrong with ex post explanations, provided they follow the procedure I just stated. Let me take a trivial but typical puzzle, based on my own experience. Why are there so many standing ovations on Broadway today than 20 years ago? And the playwright Arthur Miller proposed this explanation. I guess the audience just feels that having paid $75 to sit down, it's their time to stand up. I don't mean to be a cynic, but it probably all changed when the price went up. When people have to pay $75 or more for a seat, many cannot admit to themselves that the show was poor or mediocre and that they have wasted their money. So to confirm to themselves that they had a good time, they applaud wildly. Now, of course, so far, this is no more than a just so story, one possible account among many. It would gain strength if it could be shown that there are fewer standing ovations when large numbers of tickets to a show are sold to firms and given by them to their employees. This would count as a novel fact. For even if these tickets are expensive, the spectators are not paid for them out of their own pocket, and hence do not need to tell themselves that they are getting their money's worth. Although this account can be buttressed by the theory of cognitive dissonance reduction, about which more later, it stands quite well on its own. So in my vision of the social sciences, microeconomics, updated as behavioral economics, and social psychology have a privileged role. They illuminate individual choices and actions that are the building blocks of more complicated phenomena. Yet they face the challenge of how we link the behavior observed in a laboratory to spontaneous behavior outside it. Many critics deny that findings from an artificial experimental setting can be generalized to other contexts. Some of these objections can be dismissed. In particular, the fact that most findings can be replicated with large monetary stakes refutes the objection that experiments are insignificant because they only involve trivial amounts of money. Other objections may be more worrisome. In the post-Milgram era, scholars are prohibited from conducting experiments with high-stake emotional charges. And extrapolating from behavioral expressions of the positive effect subjects feel when given candy or when discovering that the payphone already has a coin in it may not be justified. At the other end of the emotional spectrum, extrapolation from the behavioral expressions of a negative affect generated by unfair behavior in an ultimatum game or a trust game are not necessarily justified. Moreover, it is virtually impossible to recreate inside a laboratory the ongoing open-ended interactions that shape much of social behavior. Finally, although experimenters take great pains to create a screen of anonymity to prevent irrelevant influences from distorting the findings, very few real-life actions are completely hidden from the regards of others. To address these issues, psychologists and behavioral economists can and no doubt will refine their experiments. But they also ought, in my opinion, to go outside the laboratory. And the great psychologist Leon Festinger can serve as an example. In the process of arriving at the theory of cognitive dissonance, he was influenced by a puzzling finding by an Indian psychologist, Prasad, who reported that the vast majority of the rumors that followed the great Indian earthquake of 1934 predicted even worse disasters to come. So here's a puzzle and Festinger's solution. Certainly, the belief that horrible disasters were about to occur is not a very pleasant belief. And we may ask why rumors that were anxiety-provoking arose and were so widely accepted. Finally, a possible answer to this question occurred to us, an answer that held promise of having rather general application, somewhat understatement. Perhaps these rumors predicting even worse disasters to come were not anxiety-provoking at all, but were rather anxiety-justifying. Although the theory of cognitive dissonance arose in response to a real-world puzzle, Festinger went on to derive and test additional implications in the laboratory. And at the same time, he carried out fieldwork to confirm and develop the theory. He infiltrated a group of people who believed that the world was about to end on a specific date, and who had taken decisive, irreversible action based on that belief, and he did so to observe what they would do when a prophecy failed. If you do not know what they did, I shall not tell you. The book he wrote about it, When Prophecy Fails, is a wonderful read, and I recommend that you find out for yourself. I mention the study here only because of the exemplary methodology it embodies, combining theory, experiments, and fieldwork. And let me cite some recent research that proceeds in a similar way. The work by Linda Babcock, George Löwenstein, and their co-workers on self-serving conceptions of fairness. Their theoretical framework is similar to, although not inspired by, that of the French moralists. Roughly, they assume that human beings have two central concerns, a concern with material self-interest and a concern with having a self-image as not concerned only with material self-interest. They want, for instance, to believe that they are capable of acting fairly and not only selfishly. Sometimes we observe a trade-off between these two concerns, as when people sacrifice some of their material welfare in order to be fair, but not as much as a strict conception of fairness would require. In other cases, people bend their conception of fairness to fit their self-interest. This is the idea of self-serving conceptions of fairness. Babcock and Löwenstein carried out experiments in which subjects are assigned to the role of either a plaintiff or a defendant in a tort case and asked to negotiate a settlement. They were also asked to predict the award of the judge and to assess what they would consider a fair out-of-court settlement for the plaintiff. And a study found that plaintiffs predicted higher awards and assessed higher fair settlement accounts than defendants, and that pairs of subjects who reached more similar predictions and assessments were more likely to settle amiably than those who reached very different assessments. In a variant of the experiment, the subject had to make their assessment of fairness before they knew whether they were going to take the role of the plaintiff or of the defendant in the negotiation process. And they found that there were 4 times as many disagreements when bargainers knew their roles initially as when they did not know their roles. So genuine fairness, it seems, is possible only behind a veil of ignorance. These findings were later confirmed by a field study of wage negotiations between teachers' unions and school boards in Pennsylvania. The researchers mailed questionnaires to representatives of these bodies in 75 school districts, asking them to list the districts they felt were comparable to their own for the purposes of contract negotiation, and also whether they tended to use teachers in other school districts or residents in their own community for salary comparison purposes. Responses to both questions showed a strong self-serving bias. Moreover, the greater the difference between the answers from the two sides, the larger the likelihood that the negotiations would break down and that a strike would take place. Once again, my concern here is not with the substance, but with the exemplary methodology, combining, as in Festinger's case, theory, experiment, and field studies. Many behavioral economists are content, however, with adding real-life illustrations to the experimental findings. And as an example, let us consider the sunk cost fallacy, compellingly demonstrated in an experiment where one asks 61 subjects the following question. Assume that you have spent $100 on a ticket for a weekend ski trip to Michigan, and several weeks later you buy a $50 ticket for a weekend ski trip to Wisconsin. You think you will enjoy the Wisconsin ski trip more than a Michigan ski trip. As you're putting your just purchased Wisconsin ski trip ticket in your wallet, you notice that the Michigan ski trip and the Wisconsin ski trip are for the same weekend. It's too late to sell either ticket, and you cannot return either one. You must use one ticket and not the other. Which ski trip will you go to? And in fact, 33 out of 61 subjects chose the $100 ski trip to Michigan and 28 the other one. Clearly, those who chose Michigan wanted to minimize the amount of wasted money, not to maximize their utility. Now, to motivate experiments on the sunk cost fallacy, or to illustrate their findings, scholars often cite examples such as the Vietnam War, the tunnel under the English Channel, or the Concorde aircraft. But they rarely, if ever, try to demonstrate that these projects were actually caused by specific agents committing the fallacy. The fact that they might be does not prove that they were. To prove that they were, one would at the very least have to consider rival explanations and show that they are invalid. And let me cite an example of how one can go astray in this respect. It is perhaps a little bit unfair in the sense that the claim I shall contest is not central to the argument of the authors, yet it is a claim that they make. The example is taken from a study by Daniel Kahneman and Dale Miller on norm theory, in which they assert a correlation between the perception of abnormality of an event and the intensity of the affective reaction to it, whether the affective reaction be one of regret, horror, or outrage. This correlation can have consequences that violate other rules of justice. An example that attracted international attention a few years ago was a bombing of a synagogue in Paris, in which some people who happened to be walking their dogs near the buildings were killed in the blast. Condemning the incident, a government official singled out the tragedy of the innocent passers-by. The official's embarrassing comment, with its apparent, surely unintended implication that the other victims were not innocent, merely reflects a general intuition. The death of a person who was not an intended target is more poignant than the death of a target. The statement by the government official, it was in fact Raymond Barre, the prime minister at the time, is indeed consistent with the proposed explanation in terms of norm theory. It is also, however, consistent with an explanation in terms of an anti-Semitic prejudice. There is a considerable amount of evidence suggesting that Barre had an anti-Semitic bias, including a strong defense of Maurice Papon, and a directive he signed in 1977, later struck down by the Conseil d'État, that effectively canceled anti-racist legislation from 1972. Moreover, Barre's actual comment was somewhat less innocuous than in a paraphrase of Kahneman and Miller. He referred to, quote, the odious attacks that tended to strike Jews on the way to the synagogue and that struck innocent French citizens crossing the street. As a matter of fact, the Jews in question were French too. In my view, this phrasing supports an explanation in terms of anti-Semitism. Although Barre may not have intended the implication that the Jewish victims were not innocent, nor that they were not French, many studies show that prejudice often operates at an unconscious level. The claim that the official comment merely reflects a general intuition may be correct, but Kahneman and Miller do not show that it is more plausible than alternative explanations. To conclude, let me once again refer to Leon Festinger. Amos Tversky once told me about a meeting he had attended with the foremost psychological scholars in the US, including Festinger. At one point, they were all asked to identify what they saw as the most important current problem in psychology. And Festinger's answer was excessive ambition. The social sciences more generally have been suffering from excessive ambition. The aspirations of rational choice theory to become the master theory of human behavior offers one example. Another is provided by the strong claims often made for statistical models. As emphasized by the late David Friedman, data analysis often aspires to do more than it can deliver. In one of his comments on the use of regression models in the social sciences, he asserted that in his view, the truth of the matter is somewhere between the following: regression sometimes works in the hands of skillful practitioners, but it isn't suitable for routine use, and regression might work, but it hasn't yet. I should add that this is an argument from authority, since I do not myself have the technical competence to criticize the models that are the target of Friedman's criticism. If social sciences have to lower their aim, what should they do? Two proposals have been implicit in my talk. We should keep accumulating mechanisms and use them to carry out fine-grained case studies. In addition, statistical models should be kept simple and robust. In the words of Amar Bidet, where the medians and means and basic cross-tabulation don't persuade, the argument probably isn't worth making. Due diligence in data gathering or what Friedman called shoe leather research, should replace endless tinkering with statistical packages. Needless to say, simplicity and robustness are not enough, because good ideas are also needed. And to this end, I recommend that all social scientists spend a large part of their time immersing themselves in the classic writings of history, which can provide them both with a telling detail and the provocative anomaly. Thomas Schelling once told me that before he wrote The Strategy of Conflict, he read widely and randomly in military history. This is not the preparation current social science departments give their students. Within economics, economic history is almost at the bottom of the prestige hierarchy, just one notch above the history of economic thought. Within political science, students do read the history of political thought, but virtually no political history. In sociology, they may read Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, but to the best of my knowledge, little social history. Perhaps the best way of creating a unitary social science with a common language would be for all social scientists to have a grounding in history. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Elst, for this very inspiring, wonderful talk. And I'm inclined to think that the intensity of the applause was not linked to the price you have been paying for attending this conference, but to the intrinsic values of your thinking. The way I see it is that you go for a plea to say, yes, there is a unity in social sciences, but mind you, it's not unified. Centrality of these mechanisms which can be cumulative and which we can use as a toolbox from very different disciplines. But I also learned from your speech that as social scientists we should be realistic and we should not have too high expectations, which I think is then linked to what you have been saying also in other publications about the role of mathematics and statistics in our social theories. So there is a lot of food for thought, and I will go immediately further and give the floor to our discussant, which is Professor Rainer Silbereisen from University of Jena and also Pennsylvania University in USA. He is by training a developmental psychologist interested in many topics such as social change, migration, cross-cultural studies, etc. And I should add that he is also the president of the International Union of Psychological Science. Rainer, you have the floor, please.
Yes, I'm a psychologist, although an uncommon one, because I have been investigating the role of context beyond the individual. In particular, I'm interested in the effects of social and political transformation, such as the breakdown of the socialist system, and the consequences this may have had on adaptation and development with regard to major aspects of psychosocial functioning. Against this backdrop, I have listened with high self-interest and non-altruistic interest to a fascinating tour d'horizon from a definition of social science over a critique of the unifying rational choice approach, or reportedly the unifying approach to epistemological and methodological advice as to how gain scientific insight in the social science. But as you have realized from his thought-provoking talk, mechanisms explaining behavior vis-à-vis social structures are central for his concept. And this speaks directly to my own research interest, the processes linking social change and individual development, and then again, social change. Now, before I turn to this topic, which is central to me, let me briefly comment as a naive psychologist on his definition of what social science is. I was naturally pleased to hear that he subscribes to the idea that the aim is to deal with the proximate causes of behavior. We love that. And I'm also sympathetic with the concept that in order to study the influence between social phenomena, one has to attend to the agentic behavior of the individuals affected. Now, what surprised me in the first instance, however, was that according to Jan, the causes of behavior social science is interested in are psychological phenomena, namely beliefs, desires, perceptions, and emotions. My first thought was, aren't social institutions and structures the hallmark of, for example, sociology and other social sciences? That's my naive question. Or is this a definition that deliberately includes psychology as a social science, which unfortunately not all psychologists would like? Well, after a while, and after being informed by some reading of Renate Mainz's work, I understood the position better. Obviously, this is a particular understanding of the causal mechanisms. It is conceived as the link between the macro level and the macro level of individual behavior, whereas the antecedent social structures and consequences on the macro level, which possibly result from the individual actions, are not seen as part of the mechanisms. I got that after a while. Now, the particular understanding of social was clearer to me, and then I had no difficulty to understand the definition of science, which for psychologists, in a sense, is standard fare. We are not really interested in grand theories anymore. We had them, and they were, well, misleading, wrong, difficult to prove. Thus, the claim that social sciences should not be involved with mid-range causal, or should be involved, sorry, with mid-range causal theories is quite understandable. And by working at such a level, it will be easier to produce cumulative insights and to achieve a wider agreement within the academic community compared to what is now characteristic in social science. Now, against this criterion of cumulative and shared evidence, Jan Elster expressed his disappointment with the rational choice approach as a shared theoretical framework for the social sciences. Although it appeared to be close to a successful grand theory, over the years it became clear that from the point of view of the theory, many anomalies exist. In general, such an approach fails to describe and predict behavior in situations characterized by high levels of complexity and by high affective involvement. And this, of course, is the preferred story psychologists would bring in. It is the emotions, stupid. Now, however, on closer examinations, what actors do is not irrational, but in a sense dictated by realistic cognitive and emotional uncertainties. His plea is to replace the search for a unifying theory by the systematic study of relatively abstract and relatively many mechanisms, which he defines as frequently occurring and easily recognizable causal patterns that are triggered under generally unknown conditions or with indeterminate consequences. Now, I first, again, had difficulties with the second part of the definition until I realized that they can be resolved by assuming that the study of the conditions or the consequences is nevertheless an integral part of the endeavor, although not at the core of his interest. Even so, the interesting point is that I had expected, actually, that addressing the conditions and consequences would be the mechanisms, would turn the mechanisms to social mechanisms. You have heard and seen the impressive list of mechanisms, and I have to tell that I Googled them all, which ends up in a bunch of papers, thick like that. So there's no need for me to repeat it here. Rather, I want to share an observation with you. And this is a relatively representative observation of the entire bunch. Basically, most of the mechanisms in the list are definitely cognitive mechanisms, individual mechanisms, belief mechanisms, emotion mechanisms. And when one looks a bit deeper as a psychologist, it is evident that they represent more formalized and also more abstract versions of otherwise widely used psychological constructs. So in a sense, it is the cookbook of my discipline, or the shopping list. An example is the hyperbolic discounting. And I'm using that because I found this example really interesting, and it also referred to some of my earlier research. That is that people prefer smaller, more immediate payoffs to larger, later payoffs. Now, inspired by the results that, as we call it as psychologists, impulsivity is related to the consumption of psychoactive drugs, researchers showed that discounting was higher in addicts and that a habitual tendency for higher discounting was predictive for addiction. There was also some ideas about roots of different levels of discounting in differences in brain functioning. The psychological literature on impulsivity and research on the consumption of psychoactive substances certainly covers a broader array than that addressed by hyperbolic discounting. So there's many more potential mechanisms involved, and I think that is an important observation, that whatever phenomenon one wants to explain, it's probably a longer list of mechanisms that will be working at the same time. But analyzing addictions as a case of discounting certainly encourages new questions and connections across the field of discovery. So I see the attraction. I understand that the mechanisms mentioned need to be seen against the critique of the rational choice model. Their common denominator is that they illuminate contradictions to the rationality assumption. What surprised me, however, again as a psychologist, was that basically none of the mechanisms was social, in my understanding. So I turned to this typology of social mechanisms offered by Hedstrom and Swedberg. Now you see the reading list of a psychologist interested in sociology. When considering the link between macro and micro, they refer to mechanisms as situational, as individual action when addressing the generation of actions instilled by motives and beliefs, and as transformational when concerned with consequences of actions on the macro level. Using this typology, it seems clear to me then that the mechanisms we heard refer to the second, the individual action category. I must admit that I experienced some relief following this realization. Why? Now, in my own research, I have been studying control strategies. Psychologists like that. Others call it coping, for example, in dealing with challenges arising from social change. They fall into the class of mechanisms John Elster is in his understanding, although perhaps a little less abstract in nature. That I had no particular concept of how challenges on the societal level were translated into individual demands as input for the control strategies, in hindsight and after listening, seems to reflect the need for further theoretical work by social science rather than a flaw due to my lack of knowledge. And of course, I liked that experience. So the toolbox of mechanisms entails some surprising gaps. And these gaps all are related to the macro level, either by a downward or an upward link. Let me take the transformation of political regimes as an example. Several mechanisms are known to help to explain how interdependent actions of individuals generate aggregate effects. The emergence of collective action against an oppressive regime requires several conditions, such as the growing feeling of injustice to the social group one belongs to, or the shared perception of weak resistance of the opponent group. But this is, at least in my understanding, not yet an explanation for sustainable effects on social structures. And I thought that this is, well, one goal of the endeavor. It needs more, and I think and I hope that Jan Elster would not disagree, but respond that this is just not at the core of his interest in searching for mechanisms. But I think it's of tremendous interest for collaboration, for example, between sociology and psychology. However, he is quite clear in further methodological suggestions as to how this endeavor needs to be conducted. The search for abstract causal mechanisms requires experimentation with standardized paradigms, and we use that in psychology, of course, as well. And this experimentation comes at a price of doubts concerning the ecological validity of the behavior studied. Here he recommends a triad of approaches. It is comprised of systematic observation in order to establish an association between the social phenomena and related behavior in question, followed by laboratory experiments with the aim of systematically varying the conditions of the causal mechanism under scrutiny, and finally, the exploitation of experimental field studies in the natural ecology. He rightfully underscores that this triad of methodological approaches cannot be substituted by mere illustrations of the mechanisms, and I found this very convincing, taken from real life, which would be equivalent to ad hoc explanations. The question was, one social science or many? His answer is, one, social science on the grounds that we all can draw from the same toolbox of mechanisms and follow the methodological standards mentioned. I would like to add that the toolbox is not yet finished. It may need a few more compartments because the social needs some strengthening. Now, to be a little bit more serious, what I have learned after reading the background to the subject, carefully reading, it was not easy, listening to the talk and thinking about my own comments, probably that Jan Elster's plea for social science to search for mechanisms rather than subscribe to grand theories or be satisfied with just the analysis of patterns of covariation is correct. Further, as a psychologist, I can see the advantages of methodological individualism. And I'm also willing to accept the same for my own discipline. This is now a political statement. The causal explanation of psychological phenomena may ultimately require the working of mechanisms that are located on a more molecular level, such as brain processes. And this is the field of controversy, of course, in my own discipline. Now, in thinking about the presentation, I also became aware that the mechanisms mentioned are all more or less located on the level of the psychology of the individual actor, thereby leaving somewhat open, and maybe this is a very productive and constructive gap, the consequent outcomes of individuals' behavior for the society. Indeed, as I discussed earlier, mechanisms in this regard are less well understood, and thus their conceptualization and test represents a task for the future. It was a tremendous pleasure to read your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rainer. John, you want to respond, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rainer, for these friendly objections or supplements or whatever. I take it that the main point of your comments was that I do not really talk about social mechanisms. They're all at the individual cognitive level. They might all apply, as it were, to Robinson Crusoe on his island before the arrival of Friday. And there is something to that, I think, that reflects the field I was summarizing, behavioral economics. Some of the other examples I gave are very much concerned with interaction. The two Tocquevillian examples, for instance, about interactive emotions, envy, anger, fear, hatred are cases of that. And I do think that there is indeed a gap in the literature in that these interactive phenomena are not taken sufficiently seriously. Of course, there are all these experiments about ultimatum games, trust games, and so on, that do study two or many party interactions and that have come up with some mechanisms that I didn't include in my list because it's already was already much too long. I could have cited, for instance, altruistic punishment as a central mechanism in much current work that is definitely based on social interaction, and that could not happen at Robinson's Island before Friday arrived. Also, institutions as social facts, in my opinion, are basically sets of coordinated expectations about behavior. Institutions are just things inside people's heads. There are expectations about how other people will behave if they do this or that. They're not buildings. They are, as I said, complex, interrelated mental states. And as I said, a very important aspect of expectations is, institutions is expectations about expectations, and so on and so forth. I think study of mechanisms at the individual level has some potential for explaining large-scale social and political change. And since I've just finished a book on Tocqueville that came out last week, I'll use this example of the fall of the Ancien Régime. The famous Tocqueville paradox, or Tocqueville effect, that the regime is never so vulnerable as when it starts improving, can be explained, I think, by two individual level mechanisms. First, a purely cognitive one. A regime that makes concessions is so weak that it will be ready to make more concessions. And second, what I called in my earlier work, inspired by Paul Venn, the release from adaptive preferences. When people see that change is possible, when one ill is relieved, they suddenly feel much higher sensitivity to all the other ills that they have been patiently suffering so far. So the combination of this cognitive change and a motivational change can explain Tocqueville's dictum that revolutions occur when things are going from bad to better, not when they're going from good to worse. Yes, now I also agree that in practice, if you look at a given set of behaviors, such as addiction, you usually will have to appeal to many mechanisms. For instance, in addicts, hyperbolic discounting is only part of the story. Self-deception is also a hugely important part of the story, as any person who has treated addicts will tell you. So that's, and I think I was, in fact, involved for 5 years in an interdisciplinary project on addiction with economists, sociologists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, and so on. And what we discovered was incredible complexity and multiplicity and variety of addictions and how many mechanisms are simultaneously at work. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's immediately open up the debate, and I would say the floor is yours. Who wants to speak at this moment? Ask questions, comments? This is your unique opportunity. Yes, please. Can you introduce yourself? And there is a microphone over here. Maybe that's easy. It's in the middle row here.
Volkan Yılmaz from Bosphorus University, Istanbul. Thank you for both of your speeches. I'm wondering what is your proposed amendment to U.S. Constitution concerning history? I mean, because you propose that all social sciences must be grounded on history, but what kind of history that you're talking about? Thank you.
Well, just good books of history. In explaining social behavior, which is over here, in the conclusion, I use a list produce a list of 15, 20 books of history, usually very thick, 600-700 pages, like E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class, Paul Venn's Le Pain et le Cirque, Joseph Levinson, Confucius in China and His Modern Past, and so on and so forth. To just find good books of history and read them very closely from the beginning to the end, and something will happen.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, please, okay.
I'm Professor Charlie Gabriel Mock, member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the UNESCO MOST program. Thank you indeed for what we get from you. Yesterday we were talking of Wall Street. I have the feeling that Wall Street acted adequately because we went straight to the wall. As far as social sciences are concerned, I'm afraid that social sciences have been too scientist. Don't you think that it's time for them to become social? And I will then refer to the proposal of the discussion that we should maybe land and go down to social mechanism. I would like to hear your comment about that concern. Social scientists going social after being scientist or scientific for so long. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you mean by going social, you mean a larger extent of interaction between social scientists and the societies they are studying. I think that is probably desirable. I'm not sure it will help social science as science, and sometimes I'm not sure how much it will help society either. Because, remember, a main implication of my talk was that social sciences do much better at retrodiction than at prediction. And as we all know, social sciences have dismally failed to predict most major crises of the last quarter of a century. And I think some social scientists are useful, and many economists are very useful. You know, central banks need economists, ministries of finance needs economists. Keynes' famous analogy was with a dentist. He wanted economists to become like dentists, modest, competent individuals. You could say that economists have had the competence but not the modesty. I would phrase that a bit differently. I would say that modesty, properly conceived, is part of competence, because part of this task of reason is to know its own limits. Now, so I think some social scientists are useful, like dentists. Society needs them. Other social scientists are probably pretty useless.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
I'm Klaus Allerbeck of the University of Frankfurt. I have a question really to both our speaker and the discussant. I think you're dealing with humans and make assumptions about humans, but the mechanisms, if I read the papers correctly, are built into computer programs that do their own dealings. The New York Stock Exchange published 5 months ago or so data that speak for orders of the transaction of the New York Stock Exchange before Christmas in 2 weeks were in fact done by computer trades without human intervention. Now with subprime, to mention the current word, and the current crisis, I wonder what thoughts both of you have that you wouldn't put into print currently. What has happened if these mechanisms work based on models of the mind created by humans, but then running quite independently and not bound by the capacity of the human mind to handle 7 plus or minus 2 things at the same time?
Well, of course, these computer programs were created by human beings in the first place, so there was at least one human element. Now, I think it's a good point. It seems clear that the speed of these transactions is so enormous, and the potential for the process to get out of hand so enormous, that it might be beneficial to slow it down. As you may know, there was a proposal some years ago, the Tobin tax, to slow down, if I remember correctly, international currency speculations by imposing a tiny tax, which would be high enough to deter the computer programs, as it were. I don't think this Tobin tax disappeared for various reasons. Hard to see how it would operate in practice. And I suppose computer-driven market exchanges is an irreversible fact of life. I don't think we can build bugs into the computers to slow them down to the speed of human thought. So it's a good question, and I don't really see who has proposed a remedy to it. But maybe Rainer, something.
Thank you for the question. I have a response, which directly relates to your own words. Twofold. First, some of these mechanisms definitely are not just human. The great apes, some birds, other animals. In other words, we're talking about dynamics of living systems at a higher order. This, in principle, implies the possibility to model it. That's the one part. The other part, which both of us have not really addressed today, is that it is the orchestration and the hierarchy among mechanisms that is the ultimate goal to explain. So if there is a computer program modeling one of the mechanisms, it's almost 100% likelihood that it will not work for a complex situation. And I think my sociology friends would call it structuration. This is what then makes it sustainable, results in structural consequences on the macro level. But the question whether in principle one day that might be model-wise to establish, I would say yes. It comes at a price, a societal price, a monetary price, century-wise, maybe it takes long, but the idea is to explain higher order processes by the working of lower order, more molecular processes. This is not the old reductionist idea, because if you look into the toolbox without a description how to organize it and how to relate it to each other, it would be worthless. And there we are not yet far ahead. That's the real challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Piotr Sztompka, University of Krakow, Poland. The whole great sociological tradition emphasizes that the crucial human experience is interpersonal experience, that we live in the interpersonal space. And I wonder how this tradition, starting with Simmel and going through Weber and George Herbert Mead and beyond, how it would use the models of which you put forward, because according to this tradition, the most complicating factor is that two or more actors use these models in the interaction, in the dynamic developing process. And they are both aware of those models, at least at the common sense level. They take them into account, and even more, they can of course learn some psychology or some sociology and to find out how these models work. And now when two persons or even more, if more persons than two are put together in this interactional situation, I think this adds a dramatically complicating factor which is not yet probably taken into account sufficiently. This is in line with some earlier comments, and in fact you have already responded partly to this interactional problem, but my main issue is how the awareness of mechanisms on many sides of interaction complicates the whole logic of the mechanisms.
I will take some more final questions and then you can respond together. Yes, please, and then over there, yeah. Very briefly at this point, please.
Yes. Very briefly. Alberto Martinelli, University of Milan. You say that institutions, of course, are not just buildings, they are a set of expectations. I'm not convinced that the institution can be reduced just to a set of expectations, even to a conflicting set of expectations. So I would like to ask you, what do you think of the several attempts to combine rational choice approach with neo-institutionalism?
Thank you. And then there was a gentleman over there.
I'd like to prompt you, sir, to return to the very first question, where if I understood your response, it was essentially to read well. But to read well presumes literacy, the capacity to read well. And in my own field, I'm Pierre Ritchie. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Ottawa and Secretary General of the International Union of Psychological Science. And one of the critiques I've made in my own discipline for a very long time is that we too often tend to operate in a ahistorical framework. And I think that that's very much a reflection of, particularly in the North American context, the education that we receive, which tends to be a great deal of depth in a very narrow corridor, which doesn't prompt the kind of intellectual framework that allows one to read the kind of books that you're suggesting that people ought to read. So I'm suggesting it's not just a matter of providing a reading list, one also needs an intellectual framework. And so the question I'm putting to you is, and I'd invite Rainer, if there's time, to have him be included in the response, what do you suggest is the intellectual framework that we need to be facilitating to enable the kind of literacy that I think is required to do the reading you suggest?
Please, final comments?
Yeah, I may respond to this in inverse order. I think the situation is pretty hopeless. I think the social sciences are in a bad equilibrium, a bit like, you know, foot binding in China 100 years ago. They managed to get out of it, but I'm not sure the way they did it would be applicable to the social sciences today. The way elite departments, especially in the US, train their graduate students, make it a certainty that they will not teach them things that they will not be beneficial for them when they want to go on the job market. It's just very hard for me to imagine. Let me use an analogy from physics. Lee Smolin wrote a book, The Trouble with Physics, a few years ago. When he expressed his upsetness with the fact that in the US, in the field of particle physics, you have to be a string theorist to be hired. Although string theory, as I said, has not a single empirical prediction, verified prediction, it can claim as its own, and no Nobel Prizes. And one of my colleagues in Paris, Gabriele Veneziano, a co-inventor of string theory, confirmed that this was an unhealthy situation in his opinion, but that's just the way it was because particle physics had gotten into a bad equilibrium. No single department would unilaterally start giving their students a broader education, because then they wouldn't get hired. And and I think there is something peculiar about the US, maybe because it's such a big country, so they don't really need to learn other languages. And of course, many books are translated into English, but many are not. And so there is a lack of sense of history, and lack of awareness of other countries and other traditions, and even the American traditions. American political science students are not taught American political history, which I think is absurd. So I don't know how anyone could go about reforming it, and I think reforms are unlikely. Well, about rational choice theory and neo-institutionalism. Frankly, I've been at conferences with this topic. I think I published an article in a book that came out of one such conference, and I still don't quite understand what it's all about. For me, this seems to be a question of labeling, not of substance. You know, maybe I'm wrong-headed, but I never quite understood what the point was. Now, about interaction. One thing I would like to say, perhaps, is that in the history of the social sciences, in my opinion, the most important breakthrough ever was the emergence of game theory. not as an explanatory tool, but as a conceptual tool. Because, for instance, the phrase I just used, bad equilibrium, I'm sure people have always vaguely understood that societies could get stuck and that unilateral change was impossible. But to understand exactly how this came about was an intellectual feat that just makes things much more transparent. Or take another example. We have always known, since there are proverbs to that effect, that it may sometimes be rational to burn your bridges or burn your boats. But not until Schelling in 1960 did we understand exactly how it could be rational. And I think I think game theory as a way of illuminating social interaction has been absolutely revolutionary. But I would add, on the conceptual level, on the explanatory level, the successes are much more limited, mainly, in my opinion, because of the pervasive factor of multiple equilibria in many interesting situations, and also because of the impossibly stringent cognitive requirements made for the realization of equilibria that do not consist of dominant strategies. So I think, and I think in a way, I've been rereading Tocqueville. You can see him struggling with game theory. I can see the prisoner's dilemma. I can see the assurance game. I can see iterated coordination through iterated interaction, but it's all a bit unfocused. Bringing all that into focus was a wonderful achievement of social science. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And with this note, we will conclude this first session of the day. I think, and I hope I can speak on behalf of all of you, this was quite stimulating, even very provocative at some stages, and there is a lot of food for thought and further debates. So it's my pleasure now to invite you to the coffee break, where we can all continue our debates. But first we have an announcement by our president.
Yes, this was food for thought. I'm talking about food for food, and that has to do with the dinner this evening. You can have a free dinner, but you have to sign up in the registration booth so that the cooks will know how many they are going to cook for. So please, if you can just go and sign up, and you will have a free dinner. Thank you.
Thank you. So, final word is thanks to both of the speakers, and thanks to the audience for listening. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. So.